Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we are really delighted to have Gillian McAllister with us this afternoon, or probably the evening where Gillian is right now. Is it about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock?
Yeah, 8 o'clock.
Blimey. All right. Well, this is the brand new book called Famous Last Words, and we are going to be getting, I believe, some signed book plates. So I'll go ahead and put a link in the comments field if you'd like to order a copy. And if you have questions for Jillian, go ahead and type them in, and Barbara will bring me on screen towards the end of the hour. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Hello, Jillian. Very nice to meet you.
Hi. Nice to meet you too.
Thank you. So, I don't have a copy. I gave mine back to the bookstore because actually we're running kind of low, but luckily we can reorder. And I believe that publication date was yesterday. Am I
That's
right?
right, yesterday, yeah.
Is that true in the UK as well? They don't always sync.
Yeah, the UK went 3 weeks earlier. So we did the 30th of January here. So almost the same, but not quite.
It is almost the same. Well, anyway, as I was saying to Jillian before we went live here, this is a marvelous book and a little difficult to discuss without any spoilers. So if we sound vague, it's going to be purposeful because really, the book is so surprising that any hint of why it's surprising will not be fair. So, Jillian, you've written other wonderful books. If I remember right, one of your earlier books was was it a Reese's book club pick?
Yeah, that's right. It was, yeah, in 2022.
Okay. Do you find that American audiences are more receptive to your books than British, or is it kind of the same?
It's similar, I think. I think people are people, aren't they? And I think a lot of my readers just want to read about often women facing a extraordinary situation, really. So yeah, it's quite a similar audience here and there, I'd say.
That's good to know. I mean, we've done lots of events for Alice Feeney or
Mm.
um, yeah. And Anne Cleeve's novel, I find sometimes that American audiences get lost in the British, and I didn't know if it, was necessarily across the board true. But in this book, I think that you could be any nationality and, get the same excitement from reading the book. You want to tell us a little bit about the setup?
Yeah, so Famous Last Words tells the story of Camilla, who is an ordinary woman who's just finished her maternity leave and is dropping her daughter at daycare for the first time. And she wakes up that morning and her husband isn't there. And this is fairly unusual, but she puts it down to him having maybe a work thing she'd forgotten or, had to be somewhere. And she goes to work as normal and she sees in the foyer of her office there's a TV and it shows a breaking news alert that there's a hostage situation happening just down the road in central London where her husband works. And she dismisses it again, but sure enough, the police turn up and they tell her that he is caught up in it. But they tell her that he hasn't been taken hostage and that he is, in fact, the gunman. And the book really begins there.
Oh, what a terrible premise. Right.
Thanks.
Right. Maternity leave in the UK is far longer than maternity leave generally is in the US. So
Mm.
how long has she been at home with the baby?
She has 9 months off, which is actually short for here. Um, I had 2 days maternity leave before I was back to writing this book as it goes. So it's not always that long, but it is typically a year over here.
That's so generous. I remember a friend of mine who was an editor at Macmillan and went off to Australia on her maternity leave and then liked it so well she never went back to London. So I thought there are possibly hazards, for employers in these very
Fair,
long
yeah.
absences. I think here it's shorter. I can't remember, maybe it's 3 months now. Earlier it was 6 weeks.
Wow.
But the only
Yeah.
reason I mentioned it is that, she's not used to going to work. She's used to being
Mm.
at home with her husband and the baby. So, it's a little fiendish of you to have set it up. So this poor woman, drops the baby at daycare, which has to be somewhat traumatic for the first
Mm.
time, and then shows up at work and is greeted by this. So tell us a little bit about her work, because I think it's fun that she has the kind of job that she does.
Yeah, so she is a literary agent. And more importantly, she is her husband's literary agent. He is a writer, and she therefore interprets a note he left her, hence the title Famous Last Words, but also lots of other things he left behind, like scribblings in notebooks and even his receipts. She feels like she alone and uniquely has the ability to interpret him and why he might have committed this crime. And the novel really has that as a theme running through it, the theme of writing and escaping to other worlds through writing, but also the kind of notion of narrative resolution. And she, as a literary agent, is seeking that possibly more than other people would, because she's so used to wanting an ending, I suppose.
Well, yeah, I can certainly see it. Well, particularly in her case, she wants a ending that's not tragic, although that's not going to come her way, is it?
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty hard to imagine how it could.
Indeed. What inspired you to write this story?
Well, I think I've been playing lately with the idea of kind of taking big action thriller tropes, like a hostage situation. We've seen it in Die Hard. But I suddenly thought, how could I put a spin on that is both more female and emotional, but also more realistic, and sort of not be writing about explosions and detonating and swag bags and all of that, but actually, how does it feel to be in the police interviewing room when somebody you love has done something so high profile? And I kind of really wanted to write about a realistic experience of hostage negotiation as well, and spotlight it on a relationship rather than, what most things tend to concentrate on, which is a more male experience, I would say.
So, if she weren't a new mother with a new baby, do you think that she would react any differently?
Um, I think that who her baby's father is gives more weight to her own anxiety, because it's not just Camilla who's, marriage is suffering, it's also her daughter now has a notorious father. Um, but I do think that ultimately, actually, the character's main motivation was her happy marriage, actually.
No, I understand that, but I mean, I have read other books, where lifelong trauma can result from a child whose parent is either missing or has committed some terrible act. It's some sort of like advanced PTSD or something. I just read an
Mm.
Irish story because with March coming up, one tends to sort of read some Irish things to recommend, and that is certainly true for the characters in the book. And there's a new book coming out. You might have heard of it. I think her name it's called Broken Country. Does that ring a bell with
I
you?
have, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's that whole thing again about, children, and how, the deeds of the parents can reverberate throughout their whole lives.
Yeah. And I think there is that pressure in this book of the repercussions of the crime he committed. Without giving too much away, it spans quite a large time scale, like perhaps longer than you would expect. And one of the things I enjoyed writing about was the direct aftermath, but then the long a long time later aftermath I found very interesting, because it's actually, it would still affect you every day, even years later.
Oh, it absolutely would. Given the fact that she is a literary agent and, as you say, her husband's literary agent, would one expect that finding out that he, was the hostage taker in this situation derail her career? How does she overcome that?
Yeah, I think publishing is fairly interesting because it's relatively genteel. I think it's somewhat less direct than other industries. So I think what happens in the book probably is true to life, where people kind of want to mention it but don't. And she doesn't really want it to be kind of on her, Googleable search history. So she changes her name back to her maiden name after a while. And one of the things I liked about that was the things that went unsaid within that, because she does have clients who skirt the issue. And I think a lot of us have kind of, witnessed those sort of awkward things where you have a professional relationship, but that there is a personal element that you're aware of. And I particularly kind of enjoyed writing that.
Well, I can certainly see that you would. I guess part of my question was her husband her most successful client?
No, I don't think he was really.
Okay.
He's a ghostwriter. This is pretty nominal fees, and he's fairly he's a bit of a hobbyist. I think his character, and this is why it's kind of so mysterious that he commits this crime. He's very sort of happy-go-lucky. He would, extend a work deadline in order to have a bit more fun over the weekend or whatever. And so she has other fiction clients that are more high profile, I think. But what I actually like about that is that it there is a little bit of mystery within why he might have done this relevant to his job. Is he got caught up in something with the ghostwriting? But for the most part, there are almost no clues. And I found that more compelling to write about, that this is extremely uncharacteristic. He's quite an unproblematic person. And that, in a way, is a clue in itself that this is not a crime with deep roots. It's more likely that he has kind of seen something by chance or got caught up in something accidentally. And I kind of wanted to seed those clues throughout, really.
Yeah, no, that makes perfectly good sense. I guess what I was thinking was, um, if he really were a key to her own success, then it would shatter her career to have this happen. But if she, had, as you say, more other and successful clients, and, in that very British way where sort of, as you say, nobody really mentions it and we all just kind of get on with things, she could keep her job, because it would have been really shattering if she lost her husband and lost her career, and
Yeah,
therefore
and I think actually if I wrote it again, I might make him much more high profile, because that is ever so interesting thing to say. I think it would have been very cool if he had been kind of semi-famous already, but in a good way.
yeah, no, it would be. But also, if you then had her struggling with, you know, providing for her daughter in an income, I mean, living in London is at best incredibly expensive. So, she can't, obviously was she the heavier earner?
Yeah, definitely.
So,
And
so financially,
yeah,
at least this wasn't devastating. Um,
yeah,
Emotionally, yes, but you didn't saddle her with, the additional completely crushing, moving to, a small cottage in the Outer Hebrides or something in order to survive.
yeah, I know. I think I threw enough at her, really. And I wanted her to maintain a relatively unproblematic relationship with work, because it's such a central part of her character that she kind of sinks into fiction.
Sure, no, I understand that, but also she's going to stay in London during this long period that
Mm.
evolves. She's going to have a job and an income in
Yeah,
order to do that.
totally.
So you can't, in fact, exile her and see what happens. I certainly wish we could talk more. We really should be having this conversation 6 months from now, when we could make it a condition, if you're watching it, that we could discuss how this book
Maybe
resolves.
we can.
Well, yeah. Well, when the paperback comes out, I always sort of feel like that's an opportunity. We actually have done follow-up events with authors upon occasion, when it feels like there's a compelling reason to further discuss the story. But
I'd love to do that.
sure, we can look into that. And, the time difference actually works in our favor, because we have this ludicrous event schedule in the evening. But
Mm.
in the daytime, it's now 7 hours, soon to be 8, because of
Mm.
daylight time. Um, that allows us to do things in the middle of the day that doesn't conflict with anything else we do. So that might be fun. Maybe we could get up a group of
Yeah,
authors and kind of do a round table. That's one of the great things about Zoom. It does let you do multi-author events in a way that is financially not feasible.
yeah,
Everybody had to come to the same location.
yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. And I can definitely ask some of my British author friends. I'm sure they'd love to come and do a joint event.
Sure, that would be fun. Well, tell us, since we haven't really had a chance to talk to you, tell us a bit about, this is not your first rodeo. Um,
Mm.
Tell us a little bit about you, how you decided you wanted to be a writer, and what drew you to writing this kind of story?
Well, I'd written all of my life, really. I did an English degree wanting to be a writer, but had no money and needed to earn, and didn't feel like I could just write a book and, hope it sold. I needed to pay the rent every single month. So I did a conversion from my graduate degree to law, which is kind of something you do here. You do an extra year and you can become a lawyer. Um, so I did that. And then actually I got quite ill with mononucleosis, I think you call it over there,
Mhm.
and spent a year off work in bed, completely bedbound, with kind of very strange symptoms that nobody could get to the bottom of, but does happen to some people with mononucleosis. And was pretty disabled in the years following. For at least 3 to 4 years, I was not as functional as other people. And I used that time to write a novel, which I then, long story short, after a lot of submission, I got some interest from agents, but no offer. So then once I was back at law part-time, I wrote another and got signed. And that went out to publishers but didn't sell. So I wrote a third novel, which was a thriller. The others had been more like women's fiction. And I think you can see the roots of that in the thrillers I write today. They're certainly more emotional in tone than other thrillers, I think. So I wrote my first thriller, and that sold to Penguin, and became a bestseller in the UK. And received a myriad American rejections, really, until my novel that got Reese in 2022, which was my seventh published novel here. So I always say, authors, even jobbing authors like me, still receive rejections, and are no stranger to, circumstance not going their way. But since 2022 and my sort of Reese book, my life's changed completely, and I'm very happy being a full-time author now, working on a book a year pretty much, often in my pajamas. So it's not a bad lifestyle.
No, not a bad lifestyle at all. Well, you certainly underlined the thought that, successful career in writing depends on persistence. I mean, it takes genius and all the rest of it, but there are very few overnight successes.
Yeah, and you can look like one and not be, because there's been a decade of private failure before that, and that is definitely the case for me.
Sure, but and then as you point out, nothing's ever totally wasted for a writer. So even if those books didn't sell, there are kernels of this and that that are, translatable into other fiction. What kind of lawyer did you become? A solicitor or a barrister?
I'm always impressed when people know the
No,
British
no,
term.
no. I'm one of those myself, a long time ago.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Oh,
no,
wow. Oh,
yes,
how interesting. So I was a solicitor.
right. I thought you
So,
probably were, right?
yeah.
And I will ask you this because one of my absolutely all-time favorite books that I read last year from the UK is called Of Mice and Murder. And it's set in the Temple around 1900. And the victim is the Lord Chief Justice, who is found shoeless lying outside his chambers. And you might not have heard of it, but I'm telling you, it is in fact, when I was in London last June for capital crime, I deliberately went to the Temple and, walked the grounds.
Wow.
And very nice man. I find that books are a passport. So if you sidle up to, like the gatekeeper and you point out to him that you've read this book and you just want to see the murder site, it works,
Yeah.
they let me in.
Yeah. Books are a
It's
passport. I love
but
that.
but if you were a solicitor, I can't recommend this. She was, in fact, a very distinguished member of the Temple Bar, and retired and decided to write this wonderful book. So you might want
Of
to look
Mice
at
and
it.
Murder. I'll read it. Thank
Of Mice and Murder, and I'm living in hope that she, coming to writing at a more senior age than you, but less senior than me, I hope that she will write another book, because There's so much about British law. I mean, American law and British law stem from, a common background, but we don't have institutions here like the temple.
Yeah. And do you mostly have advocates rather than solicitors or barristers?
Well, we have mostly people who can do both. Once
I
you're
see.
licensed to practice law, you don't have to choose. I mean, many people go into specialties. You can, I mean, when I graduated from Stanford back in 1962, I thought about going to law school, but I was told back in those dark ages that I would spend my life in family law and juvenile court, and I was appalled. So instead, I became a librarian and worked in Washington at the Library of Congress. And then after I saw how that went, I then studied law. I've read the law. I'm one of the last people in the United States that was able to come to law by reading the law rather than going to law school. But that
Wow.
means I can only practice law in the state of Virginia if I wanted to do that, because that's where I read the law. And that's why I have a bookstore instead. And but it was all great preparation. Being a lawyer, I think, teaches you a way to think,
I
which,
always say that. Yeah.
well,
I
it's
always say that.
wonderful for you as a plotter because, lawyers are always faced with what if
Mm.
the consequences, what will they be, and so forth. And that's great in business, but it's certainly great in plotting crime.
Yeah, and I think a file of evidence is very similar to a plot full of clues. I think it's a really similar way to think, definitely.
Yeah. So, what do you like writing standalones? You like the idea of creating, situations that are horrible for everybody, possibly even for you while you're writing them, but then you get to move on. So you really prefer separate stories rather than any kind of a series?
In general, yeah, I think I like the every woman facing a kind of crazy situation. I do think I have a recurring lawyer in me, but I haven't found it yet. Maybe one day.
Maybe one day. So I know that there's a very large and supportive community of women crime writers in England writing, women's fiction. Can you see yourself, for example, writing a book with a male character at the center?
I actually am at the moment doing that.
Oh,
Um, so this is my 2027 release. So my 2026 one is done, and this is the 2027 one. So yes, it has a male narrator, which is actually really fun. I've never really done it. I have male sort of sub narrators, but this is a main character.
wow. Well, I'm really glad to hear that because there seems some pressure in publishing, that you can only write that which you actually are. I mean, it tends to be cultural, certainly tends to be racial. But I often sometimes think now that, women can't write men and men can't write women with any, without some kind of pushback. And I'm really horrified by that. I mean, if you're writing fiction, you should be able to write about anything you want to make up.
It's certainly interesting, and I sort of wondered if my primarily female audience would find him relatable, but actually you can do that in the first two sentences, you know. It's not the case to say that women can't relate to men. So it's going okay so far. We'll see.
I love it. I think the idea of having a man as the protagonist and the woman being the villain would be a really good idea. But
Well, yeah, and the book's really all about the woman. It's just that the man tells the story.
okay. So the focus is really on the female, but he's the narrator, the point of
Yeah,
view character.
exactly that.
Right.
Yeah.
So in your book, there is a time lag, but it is a book that moves story that moves forward from the quote instigating incident to be annoyingly
Yeah.
brutal. From the instigating incident towards, where we sort of pick it up again and move towards something. Have you, I know I've read your earlier books, but I read so many books, it's kind of hard for me to keep them all in my head. Do you like jumping timelines or do you prefer a forward narrative?
It does depend what the book requires, I think. I felt with Famous Last Words that the siege had to have an end. I didn't want to stretch it out for the whole book and just
Right.
have it be the end and you find out why he did it. I needed I had an instinct that I wanted to kind of crack the book open at about a third of the way in. But yes, I mean, I've written Wrong Place, Wrong Time is my Reese novel, and that is told backwards.
Yeah, I thought I remembered that.
Yeah. So I do play with time more than I sort of seem to be known for it, but I don't set out to do it, but I think that some books require it. And and that one was a woman, her son murders somebody and she wakes up the day before it happens. So naturally the reason for that crime was buried somewhere in the past. So it made sense to go backwards. That's how it felt for me. So yeah, I don't normally set out to play with time, but I sort of unwittingly do.
Well, I'm a big fan of police procedurals and private eye novels. I mean, partially because they were so prevalent when I was a much younger reader,
Yeah.
and generally they move forward, from
Yeah.
whatever towards resolution. Um, and and so part of me, really likes that structure, but increasingly we're finding books that they relate to cold cases, for example, and so some authors choose to, jump back and forth in time between, then and now, that kind of thing, or do dual timelines in historical fiction. There's quite a lot of that, where you've got two stories running underneath you.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, it's quite fashionable, I think. And I think what I seek to avoid is you don't want the reader to think, oh no, we, just got interested in this and now we're 50 years ago. I think you have to be careful with what you ask the reader to do up front, like how much to invest, especially in a thriller where, they expect, I always think of it as dealing cards. Like you can't keep the whole hand and deal it at the end. You have to deal them cards as you go because they have to feel as though there is propulsion and they're getting some answers. And I think dual timelines can stop that from happening sometimes. So I think it has to be treated with quite a light hand if you do it. But I think it can be really powerful. Like Lisa Jewell often does it. And her novels are like a really fun kind of puzzle box. And you kind of don't really know how it's all going to fit together. And that's actually the cool element to it is how is she going to pull it off?
I agree. And I remember Fiona Barton came here with her first book that had an extremely interesting kind of
Oh, The Widow, yeah.
yeah, The Widow, and twist in it. And I am devoted to Alice, whose books are completely unpredictable. So, you never know exactly what you're getting with Alice. Um, and I think that's fun. I'm going to reveal again that I don't remember how far back I read you. Do you find the idea of maybe a courtroom novel to be interesting?
Yes, I have done one, which is very unknown in America because it's pre Reese's book club. It's called The Good Sister.
Okay.
It's my yes, it's my only courtroom drama. It's about a woman who is looking after her sister's child, and the child dies, and it's her murder trial. Um, and what I kind of liked about it was that there are 19 witnesses, and each chapter, a new witness takes the stand, but you see what they saw of the crime in their own voice. So you get out of the courtroom and you're kind of in their head on the day of the murder, and each one offers a slightly different perspective on what happened. It's a pretty tough subject matter. But I did really enjoy the structure of the court, like the prosecution going first and then the defense and the last witness very often being the defendant lends itself so easily to narrative.
Mhm. Well, actually, my experience in court is that the person who tells the best story usually wins, even in the
Yeah.
face of logic or occasionally in the face of evidence. So, I mean, I do think that you have to look at a trial as storytelling. I mean, it truly is. Um,
Yeah.
so that might interest you further as you go down the line. But what fun. Are you enjoying now that you are a successful published author as compared to a working her way towards it? Are you having fun with it, or does it get to be a burden when you're famous?
No, it's never a burden. Um, and I think it can become difficult because it's so blurred, the boundary of I don't really know if I'm working or playing a lot of the time,
Okay.
which is great. I did it for free. I think what I like most is that when it does feel sort of larger than life around publication and you're doing interviews and all of that, I still like to sit with my work in progress on my computer that has no E key because it's 10 years old. And it's very humbling to be working on a book that inevitably doesn't really work for ages. And that makes me feel much more grounded. And that's, it's still the same process. It's still that missing E key in me.
You have a B keyboard without an E, right?
Yeah, I know. I can press it, but it has no like button. So I press the underneath bit.
I have a keyboard like that. I'm trying to remember now that we're talking, which letter is it that's missing? It might be the comma key. Anyway, yeah.
Oh, that tells a lot. Are you a fan of a comma?
I like the Oxford comma. I am
Oh, me
actually a
too.
fan. Okay,
Me
good. I
too.
am a fan of the Oxford comma because I think my mind tends to think in clauses. But, I was
Mm.
saying the other day, it was a horrible realization. I started the store in October of 1989. It was a 50th birthday present to myself. My husband was being very supportive. And, he said to me, I always thought these are the most motivational words that has ever been applied to me. He looked at me as I was about to turn 50, and he said to me, now that you can do whatever you want, he said, what is it you're going to do? Implying that, just like loafing through the next decades of my life wasn't a choice. And I really missed the Library of Congress, but Rob said, I don't want to move to Washington. You could go back there, but I really don't want to do that. And I thought, well, okay, if I don't have to do anything, it'd be fun to have a little bookstore. And it was intended, and still is actually intended. It's a not-for-profit bookstore, so I do it for fun. But it's kind of gotten away from me, bigger than I ever expected it to. But that leads me up to say that because of the nature of Scottsdale, where back in 1989, nobody in the old town part of Scottsdale actually lived there. And most people that were there were tourists who were there to for the art galleries and all. It was a big art nexus between Santa Fe and La Jolla in California and so forth. And so everybody that walked into the store in its first week or two was from somewhere else. And they would come in and
Wow.
they'd say, a mystery bookstore. What fun. I wish we had one of these back home in like wherever. So I got out a yellow legal pad and a pen on a whim, and I said, well, sign up here, I said, and I will write to you. And then I went home and said to my husband, who will care? Who will care if I write to them and say anything? And he said, well, you won't know if you try it. Anyway, long story short is I have written a newsletter now to 27,000 people every time it goes out
Wow.
since November of 1989. I have not missed a single month.
Wow.
No
Were there
kidding.
any months you wanted to miss?
Um, no. And the thing is that the flood of books published keeps increasing. It was a
Mm.
much smaller community. Um,
Mm.
but but publishing has expanded. So on average, you may not know this, but in the US, on average, there are over 2,000 new books released every week. And so that's across a fair spectrum. But
Wow.
if even 10% of that is fiction, not necessarily crime, but just fiction that we might want to pay attention to, that's still 200 books a week or
Mm.
some 800 books a month. And so it's gotten more difficult to decide which books one wants to highlight, which books one has
Mm.
time to read. The event schedule has a whole lot to do with all that. And so you can't actually afford to miss a beat because you would be so far behind, you would never have
Yeah.
a chance to catch up. And also, if you have 15 people whose paychecks come from you, you can't really be too cavalier about it, like,
Mm.
I'll just blow off, I'll just
Yeah,
march and
of
nobody
course.
will get paid is not really going to work. So I feel,
Wow.
in some ways it's kind of the same thing about, as a writer becoming locked into a productive schedule, with a book every so
Mm.
often. It's really the same, but different.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
writing, I'm reading them, but
Yeah.
it's symbiotic. So I
Yeah.
don't, I mean, I'm grateful that I am still healthy enough at 84 to do all that. Um, do I have any interest in quitting? No, because what else would I do but have the pleasure of, say, talking to you at 1 o'clock on a, weekday afternoon. So
Wow.
who knows? But
Yeah.
it is kind of a cage, and that's, I guess, in a way why I was asking you those questions. Do you ever wish that like you could just take a year off and not have to think about a book?
I wish I could take a year off my own mind,
Ah,
but the mind wants to think of books.
oh,
Um, so I'm very interested that there are so many more books published. Is that in line with population or is it accelerated, would you say?
it's accelerated. And you know, publishing tends to follow fads. And right now, with the situation in the world, and particularly here in the US, chaotic would barely describe it. We are religiously non-political, so that's all I'm saying. But so we're finding a big uptick right now in that people are reading
Mm,
romance, fantasy, cozy kind of
to
books.
escape, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's not just escape. I think it's kind of comfort reading, and
Mm,
in most crime fiction, not always, but in most crime fiction, there's an actual resolution, and
yeah.
some kind of justice is achieved. There's been a big uptick in reading classic crime, golden age crime. Poison Pen Press, which we sold to Random House some time ago. But when my husband and I ran it for 20 years, one of the things we took on was the British Library crime series, Martin Edwards
Wow.
editing it. And they're all classic crimes from sort of the golden age of British crime writing, not the first tier, not, Sayers and Christie, because those books are still locked into their major
Yeah.
publishers.
Estates and all of that.
But,
Yeah.
authors like John Dixon Carr, for example, and a marvelous woman, I'll have to go and look at it. Mary Kelly, her name is, wrote an absolutely fabulous mystery set, believe it or not, in the Potteries. I mean, it's just
Wow.
brilliant. I know.
That's so interesting.
And so what we're seeing is people started in the pandemic when people had reading time, but we're seeing it still separate that one of the fastest turning categories that we sell is in the classics section. And up until COVID, we might have sold like, 8 classics a month. And now it's,
Mm,
20 a day, 20 or 30 a day. It's really interesting.
wow.
So I think right now we're seeing more people reading in the US as entertainment, escape, also as price friendlier. But we're also seeing a rise in a lot of independent, self-publishing, small publishing, because the big guys are all consolidated into like 5 major companies. And
Mm,
in a way, what that does, kind of like a forest fire in reverse, it clears out the underbrush so that smaller companies and entrepreneurs can kind of grow
mm.
up under that shelter, like a forest
Yeah.
reborn after a fire.
Yeah.
So I think that accounts for quite a lot of it too. So we work
Are you
hard.
sure you're not a writer? You've used two amazing metaphors during this call.
Well, I actually am a very good editor. I really loved editing, and I still do. I still do freelance editing because I just love it. But no, thank you. I'm a reviewer and I'm an editor, but I just don't have a mind for making things up. I don't know why. You know,
That's so
we
interesting.
all have our own strengths. But anyway, I'm glad to hear there's a new book for next year. It's always good to leave fans with that good news. And let's call Patrick up and see if anybody watching, which will be a smaller number at this hour, but we find that most people watch our Zoom events the next day. So did your publicist give you the links?
Yes, she did. Yeah, she did.
Because they grow like wildfire once you start promoting them. And they usually run about 1,500 plays.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
How
it's really
exciting.
good. Oh, Patrick, you put the sign up.
Yeah, why not?
Excellent. Duck your head because we can't really
Yeah,
see it. There we go.
shameless
Patrick created a
product
backdrop and
placement.
then we sort of forgotten it lately. So,
Yeah.
hey.
Well, there have been some questions about film and TV stuff. Catherine wants to know any news on the film of that night.
Yeah. So it's shooting as we speak, in the Dominican Republic. I'm going to go out soon and have a cameo. That's the news. So it should be on TV in 2027.
How great. Alfred Hitchcock has a lot to answer for.
Yeah.
Or the man who played Morse. You remember Colin Dexter? He used to pop up in Morse. Did you
I
ever?
love that.
No, you really did. Did you not? If you knew Colin, when you watch Morse, he would always make one appearance.
I see. I
Yeah.
see.
Lee Child shows up in Reacher. It's become kind of a thing.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah, I'm very happy to be joining that canon.
Oh, good.
There's a question about what kind of books do you like to read? And do you have any guilty pleasures?
Um, I
Confess.
don't believe in guilty pleasures. But I mean, I read a lot of pre-release thrillers. My taste runs similar to what I try to write. So this sort of more character-led end. I really liked Hannah French. And I recently read a book called Night Watching. Have you read it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
love it.
I thought it was fantastic. One of those books you think, how is she going to pull it off? And she does. Yeah. So really like that about a woman who sort of suffers a home invasion. And much of the novel plays out closed set in her house. I just thought it was great. Yeah, I really like Lisa Jewell, really like Ruth Ware. Just currently reading Dolly Alderton, Good Material. I'm really enjoying that. Really like fresh writing. Also a male protagonist in a romance novel, which I like. Oh, I think you're muted. Sorry.
Patrick, you muted yourself.
Oh, so I did.
Yeah.
Well, I have this really loud server next to me, and so I don't want to. Now it's kind of behaving itself, but
Good.
Uh, I thought
yeah,
you
so
just didn't like Dolly Alderton, and there was an awkward
exactly.
silence.
Hiding the
Um,
wall, right? That was a very good book. I agree with you. I thought it was excellent and
Thank you.
still fun.
let's see.
Yeah, yeah.
Most of the questions here are really things that you've already talked about. How did you come up with the plot for the new book? Um, things like that. A lot of people are just tuning in to say how much they love your work.
Oh, that's nice.
I think that's about it actually for questions.
Do I recall that you were possibly coming to see us in the recent past?
I
Or
was supposed to be, yes, and
what
I
I
got
thought?
unwell.
Yes.
Um,
And so I want, are you all better now or has been?
yes, I had hand, foot, and mouth. How Victorian is that?
How in the world did you get that?
I got it from my 2-year-old, but most adults don't get it. This is a relic of my health issues, I think, in the past. I just get everything, like everything. But yeah, I was covered in spots. So even if I had been well, you would not have wanted me on a plane. Um, so I looked pretty like contagious. So yeah, yeah, we were supposed to do that in early October.
Well, I can hope, well, let's all hope that maybe you can reschedule it at some
I'd
point.
love to, yes. Hopefully you only get a hand, foot, and mouth once, I think.
I hope so. If you're coming our direction, I will tell you two things. One, there's a nonstop from Heathrow to Phoenix, which is wonderful
Oh,
on
nice.
British Air. And two, don't come in the summer because it's just too hard on British people. So May
Yeah.
to like mid-October is likely to be lethal. But on the other hand, this time of year is gorgeous.
How
Yeah,
warm
you
is it
might
now?
you might combust if you come here during the summer.
I'm a very
A lot of
pale British person.
Well, we'd love to have you. I hope it might work out at some point. That would be
Yeah, I
brilliant.
think it will. I think it will. Fingers crossed. My next one is set in Texas, so I'm really hoping to come. This is my first American set thriller, so I'm super excited.
That works out really well. Well, the better strategy, they always want to fly you to New York and then send you west. And it's
Yeah.
actually easier to fly that direct flight I mentioned to you, which I have taken often. It's actually easier to do that flight all the way west and then work backwards because the time works in your
Yeah.
favor.
And get less jet lagged as you go. Yeah, that makes sense.
I know, but you know, publishing is New York centric, so they tend to think that would work better. But 4 hours across the Atlantic is not nearly as relaxing as like 9.5 hours across the Atlantic.
I'm a very bad flyer, so I'm afraid I find none of it relaxing.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, it was lovely to meet you at
So
last
nice to
and
meet
talk to
you.
you. For those of you watching, I'm a real fan of Gillian's work. This book will really knock your socks off, but I think her earlier books are terrific too. So fortunately, they're available in paperback. So you might want to acquire them, but you don't have to have read anything earlier to read Famous Last Words. Yay, right?
Thank you. Thanks so much.
A pleasure. Thanks very much for watching, everybody. And Gillian, I'll send you the links to the video and the audio so you can do what you want with those. Okay?
Thank you. Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
A pleasure. Bye, everybody.